This is Changeling the Podcast. Welcome to Changeling the Podcast, the animatronic double-decker merry-go-round of fortune that nobody ever escapes. I'm your host, Puka, and I am joined by Fetch. Greetings, Fetch.
Hello, Puka. Usually I have been made by the true Fae, but today I'm a doppelganger brought to you by a near-death experience.
Sounds like a serious thing to get addressed. But yes, this is relevant.
Yeah, there's people who can help me out with my unfortunate situation of having to watch my living counterpart go around. These people called Sin Eaters.
Yeah, we're talking about Geist the Sin Eaters today. And this is our first crossover episode, I believe, for talking about New World of Darkness stuff in relation to Changeling the Lost, which feels like a milestone of some kind. But we're doing that because we will eventually be getting to the Dark Era's historical settings for Changeling and going through them in chronological order. The first one from the first Dark Era's book is a crossover story with Geist, hence our discussion today. I will say up front, I've never played Geist. I don't know much about Geist, and I'm purely going off of skimming through the first edition core book and looking at this from the perspective of how can Geist be splashed into a Changeling game. So the Dark Era that we'll get to in the coming weeks will give one answer to that question, but until then, Fetch, you've run Geist, right?
Hey, I have. I ran the first edition of Geist shortly after it came out. I had a location set in New Orleans, and we had some fun with it, but at that time I also struggled to capture the vibe of it. In the ensuing years, I've gotten more familiar with the overall vibe of Geist, the Chronicles of Darkness. I have a Sin Eater as a side character in my current campaign, and I have read all of the supplementary material because
All those books.
there's not a lot of them. This is one of the fascinating things about Geist. So the idea for New World of Darkness was that White Wolf and then Onyx Path wanted to focus upon developing books for their core three lines: Vampire, Werewolf, Mage. They did also want to put out books for other game lines. However, they were concerned about them underperforming, which I understand have been a significant issue for the original World of Darkness. Do you think that was true?
I think that, yes, things underperform when one sets unrealistic expectations for them. That is certainly true. That being said, in my opinion, one shouldn't measure the strength. And I realize that I'm saying this not from the business perspective. One should not measure the strength of a game by sales alone. But yeah, they did.
As a result of that, we got Promethean, Changeling, and several other excellent game lines, but all of which were promised like 4 or 5 supplements. Changeling was a breakout success, and by the end of it, had about as many books as Werewolf did, which is incredible. Of note is that the designers tried something special with Geist. They wanted to make a game line that was entirely self-contained, that you should not need anything beyond the core book for Geist in order to get everything. And I don't think that panned out how they hoped it would.
For more context around this, so it came out 2 full years after Changeling the Lost, because the first edition core book was August 2009. So Changeling was already a breakout success by this point. Like with Changeling, they did precede the first edition core book with a quick start. There were a few SAS adventures, and then Book of the Dead was a general World of Darkness book that had, I think, there's a dedicated chapter for Geist in it, correct?
Kind of, sort of. The idea is that the Book of the Dead, it does not have a dedicated Geist chapter. It's about a location that Sin Eaters typically visit, and because of that, there is a lot of information about what Sin Eaters do throughout the book. But then, yes, they also give an outsized focus on getting more material for Sin Eaters. Part of what makes the Book of the Dead interesting, however, is that it has an entire chapter dedicated to, so what do all of the other supernatural beings have to do with the underworld? And the answer is fascinating.
Well, so aside from all that, there was a sort of 1.1 update to the Geist core book in 2012 to account for some errata and editorial changes, some ready-made characters in 2014, and then appearances in the Dark Eras and some other World of Darkness books. Second edition dropped in March 2020 with a core book, a short supplement Memento Mori, and eventually a jumpstart. But in both cases, not much expansion on the core game.
The second edition likely had a different reason for being so short.
No.
Unfortunately, I suspect that was coming around the time that Paradox stopped approving new
Yeah.
pitches. And so Geist once again was cursed to just be 2 books, which is a weird parallel to Wraith, right? You know of the Wraith curse?
Well, I do, but Wraith did get more than 2 for what it's worth. So-
It had the issue of a very troubled production line, and that's what I mean by them being similar.
Yeah, although, yes, it was troubled by comparison with Vampire, Werewolf, and Mage, and even Changeling, but there are still a couple dozen Wraith the Oblivion books from the old days, and it was popular enough to get a 20th anniversary. So it's still one of the big 5. But yeah, no, I mean, since we're talking about it, when we look back to the antecedents to Geist, like obviously you have Wraith the Oblivion and that idea of developing the underworld and its society. But given that the protagonists of Geist the Sin Eaters are humans who deal with the dead rather than being ghosts themselves, I think actually the closer analog might be Orpheus, which was also a limited series from right at the end of the old World of Darkness. There are also some parallels I see with Mummy the Resurrection in that the Amenti from that game, similarly, they're humans who die and then come back through the intervention of a ghostly spirit. And we have ghosts in the core New World of Darkness book, which are reasonably fleshed out as a concept, although the Geists in this game are rather different. I know I also said that in our pre-show planning, the Geists kind of remind me of Shiochain in Changeling 20th Anniversary Edition a little bit because they embody these archetypes to an extent. So it's really a mishmash of lots of stuff that circles back to this notion of dealing with the dead.
There's one more major parallel that comes up in second edition. In first edition, Sin Eaters may be best understood as people who were supposed to die and then just stopped dying. In second edition, they explicitly are not.
Hmm.
You are something that is define something that is much more closer to the idea of the risen. The only reason that you are back is because you have some compelling reason to stay, and the Geist hooked into using that as a medium to revive you. I absolutely love the idea that if you want to do a Risen game, Geist Second Edition absolutely has you covered.
Nice. So before we get into it, I also kind of want to open up generally the question of crossover, which I think we've kind of talked about when we did our dive on the first edition core book, because one of the selling points that I think I hear often is New World of Darkness / Chronicles facilitates crossover more easily than Old World of Darkness. And mechanically, it feels accurate because it's clearly part of the design from the start, in that you have these templates that you build onto the same character foundation. You have a lot of the powers that used to be kind of all over the place collapsed into a single merit system that extends across game lines. And there's a certain parity to the way things like power stats work and the way they factor into roles. Setting-wise or lore-wise, though, I'm less convinced that crossover is necessarily more straightforward than an OWAD, especially because as each of the new game lines wore on, they became as extensive in character options and setting pieces as in the old games, as we've seen with Changeling, though maybe not to the extent of having like a single discernible meta plot or unified history. I know that when I've played in NWAD crossover games before, I'll agree the mechanics felt reasonably smooth, in part because it felt like they tried not to design themselves into a corner with any given splat. But story-wise, it didn't feel that different. So, like, my statement might be, the more heavily you rely on mechanics, the easier it is to integrate the systems between games in NWAD. And we had a conversation the other day on Discord about people being beholden to lore. I'd say the less you rely on lore between splats in OWAD, the easier crossover is there as well. So I don't know. I don't know what your take is on the experience of crossover between the two variations of World of Darkness, but
Yeah, I can talk to that. In Old World of Darkness, I think the only crossover that I have run is that I featured a vampire in my Changing the Dreaming game. They were a minor character who was symptomatic of the issues that the freehold or the domain was facing, rather than a primary threat or character to be dealt with. I'm also playing it in a werewolf game where there are vampires. And in New World of Darkness, I'm running that Beast game right now, which has crossover with a lot of other supernatural beings in the World of Darkness. Well, New World of Darkness. My experience has been that Old WAD is a headache for trying to do compatibility between powers, merits, even just your fundamental abilities. And I've seen games that wrestle with that, and it is a headache and a challenge, and I appreciate anyone who feels they are up for that task. However, even though the new World of Darkness is easier to do crossover, I don't think you should rush into it. I've heard of too many games where it opens up with Changing the Lost, and by the end of the first session, they've encountered an angel of the god machine, and they've discovered that there's a vampire from Requiem in the park. Cool, don't do that. When you have that many things, you are going to confuse most players, and you're going to have a hard time keeping their themes straight. And even though there is a lot of mechanical overlap, I guarantee you are still going to run into edge cases where you are not sure what to do. The book lines take great pains to discuss how to do crossover. There's a lot about that in the Contagion Chronicle, which is an explicit crossover for the Chronicles of Darkness. But even then, it's a lot. You should focus on your own game's main themes, then drip in content from other supernaturals whenever you think it's going to be appropriate and augment the themes of the main game that you are running.
yeah, and that's immaterial of whether it's old or new World of Darkness. I mean, I focus on mechanics, smoothness, and necessity of lore because I think those are kind of those are the elements that do kind of depend on which universe you're operating in. Because otherwise, yeah, it's just general good storyteller strategy to not cram the kitchen sink and everything else into your game, or try and like shoehorn stuff that just does not work for the sake of making it work.
I advise troops to treat other supernaturals the same as any other tool in the toolbox approach. It's there if you want to use it. And also remember that any other game line you introduce, its themes should be subordinate to your game.
For sure.
This is not an original idea from me, but if you're going to have a Changeling game that features like a major vampire NPC or especially a PC, give them some way that they can go out during the day. If there's a Promethean, some way where their disquiet isn't going to immediately destroy all of Changeling PCs. Still keep their themes in mind, but don't forget that you're looking to tell a cool story, and sometimes the game's mechanics and lore even fall away to make that happen. The trick is, you have to be able to do that while still making it feel like that other game line.
You just need an umbrella for the vampire and a paper bag for the Promethean. Pretty simple.
A paper bag?
All right, maybe 2 paper bags.
Oh my god.
Anyway, let's get away from crossover and talk about the game that we're talking about. How would you define the core concept of Geist? Like, give me the elevator pitch if you were trying to get someone interested in playing.
Geist is a game about second chances, both for you and others. You play as a person who was going to die, but they had unfinished business. A powerful ghost called a Geist offered you a capital B bargain to get to come back to life, but they get to come along for the ride. Your adventures are as much about helping other ghosts move on with their unfinished business as it is about finishing your own.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. And you pulled out exactly the line that stood out to me in the first core book's introduction, where it says, "What would you do with a second chance at life?" as kind of the theme question. And to me, that's maybe the strongest connection to Lost that I see, and it makes me think about the similarity and difference between the two. Because if you put aside the fact that any two individuals are going to have unique reactions to experiences, both changelings and bound, the sin eaters, go through something traumatic. Both return changed at the hands of some otherworldly entity. Both gain a new perspective on what it means to lead a human life and are able to perceive another layer of the world. But then the contrast is changelings suffer an extended durance. They are physically and emotionally warped. And if there's any rhyme or reason to why they were abducted, it's almost always cruel and or misguided in some way. Whereas the Sin Eaters simply have their moment of death, a bargain that I imagine they enter into with relatively clear eyes and presumably can have some kind of continuity in their human life, even if their perspective has changed. So it's an interesting dichotomy to explore.
Incidentally, I love the bargain because that is something that I am sure the changelings would be curious about. There's a bargain you can do where you get a free get out of death free thing, and you don't get taken to a hellish otherworld when that happens. How does that work?
That is very true. There's often also this element of responsibility that comes with stories about mediums where they have to like give voice to the dead. Changelings, by contrast, don't give voice to the Fae unless they're privateers, probably. Crews of the Bound come together for a common mission and around a shared mythology of the dead, whereas the Lost form freeholds for mutual defense and support. And all of this, I would say, is kind of reflected in the mood of Geist as well, which I guess tends towards like the macabre and the carnivalesque. They talk in the core book about making the most of life, like the eat, drink, and be merry, being inspired by the Day of the Dead. So they overall seem to be more like the gallows humor type than the often bitter and paranoid Lost. And so that just warms my goth heart.
I worry that it oversells the grimness of Lost, but you are right that the eat, drink, and be merry vibe of Geist is an essential characteristic to the game, and one that becomes more explicit in certain archetypes that you can
Hmm.
play. With Changeling, we do have the entire court, the Court of Spring, which is about desire and trying to give yourself a second chance at life, and the Autumn Court, which is oftentimes trying to scare people out of having to take a spin at this awful wheel by keeping mortals out of a terrible situation.
Incidentally, with regards to the idea of responsibility, the first edition Geist lexicon claims that the term sin eater refers to the implied burden of the sins of the dead and the potential duty to serve as a medium. And the term itself comes out of English and Welsh folklore, but there are other cultures that have similar funerary customs. And essentially, it's someone eats a food item, usually bread, in the presence of the deceased, thereby taking all of the deceased's sins into themselves. It's a tough job, but does someone actually have to do it? Anyway, I've got sort of a handful of key terms to rattle off with their lexicon descriptions. I have a question or comment associated with each of them if you can maybe contribute some insight.
I'll do my best.
Awesome. So the bound, or sin eaters, interchangeable terms, refers to the bond with the Geist, but frequently takes on a secondary connotation of being bound to fate, chance, a second life, or whatever the speaker believes to be the purpose of her rebirth. It is a little weird how this game's title format is sort of protagonist, the protagonist, and not protagonist, the noun or adjective, but maybe Sin Eaters, the bound, didn't trigger those same Wraith vibes? I don't know.
I've never been happy with the Geist the Sin Eaters title. Calling it something like Sin Eaters the Second Chance would have made more sense.
Mm-hmm. Next we have cenote, a place where the wall between the living world and the underworld is naturally weaker. Variations of this include the Avernian Gate, or a haunt if it's been claimed by a Sin Eater or another entity. Which raised the question for me, how important is place in the game? Like, do Sin Eaters hang out in haunts at the same rate as Changelings and Dreaming hang out in freeholds?
Super important.
Mm.
As I recall, in first edition, it is shockingly difficult to regain your fuel stat plasm.
Mm.
And one of the only reliable ways of doing that is by spending time at a haunt, which is your equivalent of a hollow. They loosen that up in second edition. Also, Sin Eaters care deeply about these low places because that's how they access the underworld, and it's also where all of the terrible underworld monstrosities come out of. This becomes even more explicit later on, but Puka, they spend a lot of time at graveyards. All graveyards have a guardian spirit that is the first person who was buried there.
Yeah.
And all of them can be used as Avernian gateways into the underworld.
Nice. I do like the sort of mythology behind that as well. Next, the Geist, a bizarre form of ghost, part human remnant and part archetype. Formal plural is Geista, but English-speaking Sin Eaters tend to use the less correct Geists. So what are the key differences between a Geist and a ghost?
A ghost is just a person who died with something keeping them attached. The classic unfinished business for weal or for woe. Now, over time, some ghosts gain more sentience and become more powerful, but a common fate they experience is the erosion of the things that anchor them to this world. Family members die, possessions get destroyed, homes get bulldozed over, and when there's nothing left to keep them here, they go into the underworld. I should clarify that a ghost isn't exactly you. It's an impression of you that is left when you die. It's not your soul. It's not entirely who you were. It's just like a photograph of that moment. Anyway, once a ghost goes into the underworld, it's a pretty gloomy and unfortunate place that wants to eat them and make them a part of it. Some of them find various ways of surviving. Others, however, find something else. First edition is pretty obfuscatory about the nature of Geists, but second edition clarifies what is going on here. By second edition, ghosts can wander the underworld and find the rivers. These are the rivers of the underworld, like the ones that, the boatman crosses. If a ghost drinks from the rivers, they gradually lose aspects of their humanity and become more like archetypes. Eventually, they forget who they were and instead become these more powerful spirits called Geists. Now, a Geist still has unfinished business, and it wants to get that taken care of. But once a ghost is in the underworld, doesn't matter how powerful they get, they cannot just leave whenever they want to. However, a ghost that has become a Geist gains the power to bind themselves to a person and use that to escape. I am pretty sure that Geists were inspired by the personas from the Shin Megami Tensei Persona series. So if you want to think of them as the cool archetypes like those, then you're on the right track.
So next up we have keys, a supernatural affinity for a particular aspect of ghostly power. And I will skip out of alphabetical order for a minute to also talk about manifestations, one of the ghostly powers of the Sin Eater's innate command. We can we don't want to get into like all of the powers and combinations. My understanding is that manifestations are kind of the level up things, each associated with an attribute and kind of reflecting the Arcanoi from Wraith a bit, or ghostly powers in general. And then the key governs an area of influence and is associated with a skill, which struck me as a little bit like first edition Dreaming's Arts and Realms. But I guess just, do you have any top picks to mention, or ones that might be particularly relevant to Changelings?
I want to add first that the way this works is that manifestations are things like, I'll pick one of my favorites. It's the Boneyard, which gives you absolute dominion over a wide area. But what can you do with that dominion? Well, it depends on which key you use to unlock the Boneyard. The Pyre Flame key will enable you to adjust the temperature and maybe even set people on fire.
What's the Tears one? That's like water, tear stain
Yeah,
key?
there's the water one. What's the one for machines?
Oh, industrial?
The machine key. It lets you start messing with machinery over a large area. I wrote a custom key called I think it was called the Memorial Key, and the benefit of that was that you could make an area replay events and scenes that had occurred in that location.
Intriguing.
Now, there is an obvious problem with this, which is you've got how many manifestations, Puka?
7, I believe, in the core book.
And how many keys in the core book?
10, though 4 of them are elemental and related to each other.
So because of that, they had to write 70 powers, because every key has to be able to unlock a manifestation and have a full set of abilities to go with it. When they made Book of the Dead, they added one more manifestation and one more key, and that meant that they had to write out key effects for every possible variation of that manifestation, then the benefits of every manifestation for that new key. It was such a hassle.
And all of them are 1 through 5, right?
Yeah. So imagine if you had to do that every time you introduce a new art for Changeling. If you had to like come up with a custom power for all 4 of the realms every single time.
I think I'm going to put out a supplement for each cantrip.
You would have to do that, and that's #goals. Anyway, in 2nd edition, they simplified it so that the manifestations are still here, but they're just a 1 through 5, and all the keys do is things like enable you to add more dice to the pool under certain circumstances or regain extra plasm. Relatively small benefits that mean that they could add more without adding on a ton more work for themselves.
Breadth rather than depth or something. Cool. So next on this lexical list is krewe, Krewe, as in the Mardi Gras cruise. This is a group of sin eaters united by a common purpose, usually ritually bound as well, which allows them certain advantages through a channel to the Underworld. And I believe if your crew gets big enough, it becomes a cult, and then if it gets really big, it's a conspiracy?
Yes, this is one of the things I loved about this game, because New World of Darkness had early on been pretty low-key in the areas that you dealt with. They didn't want to have the globe-spanning conspiracies. They wanted stories about what happened in this city, or even just this block. However,
people want conspiracy.
People want conspiracy. We've read about the inter-freehold conflicts in Changeling the Lost, and that stuff is fun to read about. For Geist, they went all in and they said, yep, there are bigger organizations than the local scale. Some are regional, some have been around for hundreds of years. And that if you go back even further, you have these conspiracies, which were mighty globe-spanning organizations with hundreds, thousands of years of history. There are none that exist in the modern day for 1st edition at least. And so part of the fun of the game is you could be the new conspiracy or rediscover an original conspiracy and expand upon it. Hunter the Vigil, they took this concept and ran with it, which is how you got the Hunter cells, the Hunter compacts, and then the globe-spanning Hunter conspiracies. And eventually that became the 4 tiers of Chronicles of Darkness: local, regional, global, and cosmic scale.
Mm.
It was one of the best changes they made because it greatly enhanced the ability for the game line to modulate its approach based upon the group's needs. And Geist was first edition was a major part of that happening.
Then we have Memento, an object steeped in the power of death, able to activate a given supernatural power in the hands of one of the bound, called Memento Mori by more formal Sin Eaters. There are lots of subtypes here, like a keystone, which is specific to an individual Geist, memorabilia for mementos associated with famous or infamous persons, places, or things, a death mask forged from the remains of a destroyed Geist, etc., etc. Basically just magic objects. I assume that these tend to be more necromantic in nature and effect than like a token.
I think so. They bring them back in second edition where they just kind of like give you an extra key to use, which is less interesting by
Yeah.
that point. Honestly, the real fun thing about them is that you can brag that you have, a famous weapon from history, or I'm going to try to avoid being too morbid here, but part of the fun of it is that a lot of the examples in the book are famous things associated with how a person died in real life. And so it is explicitly that thing from real life that your characters can acquire and use as a tool.
Intriguing.
Have you've seen the examples, right?
I admit that I flipped so quickly.
Okay, I'll just tell you then that one of the examples from the first edition is JFK's car that he died in.
Oh, well. Yeah, I guess there'd be some powerful mojo hovering around that particular vehicle.
I think second edition made them more generic, probably because it's like, I don't know. Do we want to? Do we
Yeah.
want to use those specific examples?
Leave it up to the players. Let the table decide. Cool. So next up is Psyche, the base measure of a Sin Eater's supernatural power. With that, you have Synergy as your morality stat, and breaks are referred to as Discord. So yeah, Psyche is your power stat. Metaphysically, what exactly does this represent? I mean, we have in Changeling Weird, and it's like your connection to Arcadia and Phaenus. What does Psyche represent here?
It's funny you should ask because that is another thing that they change in second edition. I think Psyche in the first edition was meant to represent your character's understanding of the mysteries of the dead. One of the big things in Geist is always building a mythology about why we're here and what's going to happen in the world, a theme which becomes only more profound in second edition. In second edition, they do not have a morality stat. Nope, they folded Psyche in Synergy together, and Synergy now goes from 1 to 10, which represents the measure of a bound's connection with her Geist.
Hmm.
You remember how you mentioned Discord? Well, that is the difficulty that you and your Geist have with getting along with each other. In second edition, you still have that idea, but it's not like a sliding scale that goes up and down. There's an idea that in first edition that if you die, you can come back to life, but your synergy drops by a point. So kind of a trade-off. You're gradually destroying your bond with your Geist in order to stick around. In second edition, your Geist will not let you go. Your synergy does not go down. When you die, your Geist will always bring you back, whether or not you want to come back. There is very specifically a role you can make if you want to stay dead. And if you wonder, why would I want to stay dead? It's because in second edition, when you come back, the universe kills somebody else in your place.
Oh, it's like pushing daisies, but the other worst side.
Yep.
Moving on, we have Threshold, a type or resonance of death, a loose category by which Sin Eaters can identify certain aspects of death. So I believe this applies to keys and manifestations and maybe also like the splats. Where exactly does this matter?
Oh, thresholds. This is the, death, chance, pestilence thing, natural disasters. Was that
Yeah,
it?
violence, I think, is one of them.
Yeah, so in first edition, the idea of a threshold is similar to the legions from Wraith the Oblivion. These are the manners in which your character died that they use as distinguishing markers. There are 5 of them. 4 of them are associated with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The 5th one is the super secret special 5th horseman of the apocalypse, who is tied to the concept of fate. And yes, they act as your X-splat in the XYZ triangle. In second edition, they replace the idea of the thresholds with the burdens, which I find more interesting. A burden is the idea that, to quote the book, what makes a sin eater? Dress the answer up however you like, it comes down to burden. Each of the bound died under the weight of something powerful: responsibility, greed, loss, regret, rage. That weight draws a like minded Geist to her, inexorable as gravity, shapes her return from death, and drives her along the road. So the burdens are about why you stuck around. Did you have no legacy and became one of the abiding? Are you one of the bereaved who needs to find a loved one in the realms of the dead? One of the hungry who left something behind they couldn't bear to let go? The kindly who realize they were a terrible person in life and they need to make up for it, or the vengeful who blame somebody else, right or wrong, for how they died, and now they're trying to get vengeance for that.
Got it. So the last on my list, I have the Twilight Network, which is the eclectic network of coded and underground communications Sin Eaters use to keep in touch with one another. You've also got Carol Knights, who dedicate themselves to keeping this network active, and a codex as a body of useful info transmitted across this network. I don't know how often this comes up in games, but I know you had pointed out there was also the concept of Twilight, which is rather different. So can you explain that to the gentlefolk?
Listeners may be familiar with the Shadowlands of Wraith the Oblivion, or the Vidare Mortum of Mage the Ascension. This dimension or perspective of reality that is adjacent to ours, where the dead live. Now, the two game lines are a little inconsistent about whether it's a separate dimension or just a different way of looking at our world and how deeply connected it is with the underworld. That's a topic for another day that is absolutely fascinating. But Twilight is similar to the idea, just better defined. The idea of Twilight is that in the material world, Earth basically, there exist ghosts, spirits, and other ephemeral entities. The reason that you cannot normally see them is because they exist on a different frequency from the rest of reality. It's like being on a different radio frequency. Now, some people have the ability to tap into those other frequencies. Sin Eaters can see ghosts because they can tap into the frequency of ghosts. Spirits are on a separate frequency, and werewolves can tap into that frequency. Mages are super cool and can tap into whatever frequency they want. One of my favorite things about this is that Twilight explicitly is not another dimension. It is just a frequency in our reality. And if a ghost goes into the hedge, for example, everybody can see it because there is no separate frequency for them to exist upon. They're just there. So that's Twilight.
Nice. So looking at crews, I get that practically they're the basis for getting your group of players together and saying they have a common interest. They're similar to a motley or a freehold in that they're elements of mutual support, knowledge sharing, etc. But at the same time, first edition at least, Geist seems invested in building out mechanically the crew as a concept because, like you said, there's this shared mythology and ethos surrounding death and its customs. You get dedicated experience points, crew specific merits, and so on. That got me thinking about the ecology, if that's not too grandiose a term, of sin eaters in this New World of Darkness. So, what would you say is their broader purpose in the ecosystem of supernatural creatures? Because to me, it kind of seemed like a splat in search of a question about the setting to answer.
In first edition, that was a very, very good question. What are they supposed to be doing? The answer was kind of that they were the ghost cops.
Okay.
But seriously, it was more like their purpose was to kind of regulate the underworld. There's a ton of ghosts in the World of Darkness, I think more than any other splat exists. And they help to keep them from pestering the living or suffering. And likewise, they keep bad things from coming out of the underworld.
So they're Ghostbusters, essentially.
Basically, yeah. In second edition, they add some more nuance to it. First off is the emphasis that you have unfinished business and that is a major preoccupation of yours, but also that you can go wildly the other direction. Because second edition actually has an endgame written into it. You can fundamentally alter the nature of the underworld, and I think by extension, the metaphysics of death, undeath, and ghostly existence. It's a long quest, and you have to build up your crew a lot to do it, but you can literally rewrite reality and set yourself up as gods if you want to.
And why wouldn't you? Because when someone asks if you are a god, you say,
Yes.
not quite yet.
Not quite yet.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the metaphysics, and I am curious now whether, because like I said, mummy feels like a good analog to me here, because this is not a case of possession or reincarnation or reanimation. As one of the headers in the book puts it, it is a binding of two souls in one flesh. But then there's also a wraith aspect in that the Geist sometimes pushes its urges onto the mortal, and you get that tension between, in wraith terms, psyche and shadow, although psyche has a different meaning here. So I'm curious whether the way in which the bargain unfolds and that binding happens and the relationships that they have are those things which kind of become subject for alteration, I guess, in second edition. Like, can a crew actually change the rules of how geistening happens?
Ooh, when you say can they change the rules of how becoming one of the bound occurs?
I'm just spitballing. I don't know how powerful these eventual gods over the powers of death may get. But
Oh, you're wondering about the extent of their abilities.
yeah, basically.
Well, we actually have a quick section here called Endgame, and I will just give the short version that they explain there.
All right.
Quoting second edition here. A chronicle can end in any number of ways, but Geist focuses on three: catharsis, katabasis, and kabiros. Each resolves the tale of a sin eater and her bound Geist in its own way. If your chronicle is going to build toward one of them, you should discuss it with your players before the game starts. It's much easier to build toward a satisfying conclusion if everyone is on the same page. And the summaries of these are katabasis. The way things are is not good enough. The deal is rigged and it's time to change the rules. As the crew deepens their understanding of their shared mythology and the decaying, corrupt underworld, the crew takes on ritual challenges to overthrow the underworld and create something new. This ending may happen in conjunction with catharsis. Catharsis. Resolve both the character's burden and their Geist's remembrance, which is basically the thing that keeps you around and the thing that keeps the Geist around. This can be a personal ending for one character, or the ending of a chronicle, a crew working together for resolution, for example. Catharsis allows the Sin Eater and her Geist to move on, bypassing the underworld altogether. Depending upon how their chronicle shapes up, this can happen in conjunction with katabasis. And finally, kabiros. Trade empathy for power by crushing her Geist's will and force feeding it the polluted essence of the underworld. The character ascends to become a living embodiment of the great below, a chthonic god presiding over a corrupt and dehumanizing system. After that, we have about 2 pages worth of content explaining all of these systems.
How to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank God they don't just leave it there, right?
Yeah. What would Vormas do? Yeah. That's great. Because I love those games. I mean, as I've said in relation to Changeling before, when people talk about the disconnect between like Dark Ages Fae and Changeling the Dreaming, for example, and I say, listen, if there's any splat that could retcon their own origins metaphysically, it's the Fae. And so
Yep.
I like when that becomes an option in the kind of grand chronicling. But with the storytelling, so I can envision, I would say, how a very personal sort of Geist story would go, because you have this balancing act between the Geist urges and their own, the two sets of unfinished business, putting that through a moral framework or through a mythological framework. That's like something I could see a crew unifying around. Like, do they need to redeem their Geists, or is it a test of faith to keep darker ones in check? The prelude for character creation that we get, it's structured around that arc of going from being a weirdly sensitive person to your brush with death, to how the bargain unfolded, to how it impacted you. And when we talked about themes, that theme about appreciating renewed life balanced with responsibility and the macabre but vivacious mood that comes out of that, like all of that helps me with character building and backstory, but those things in and of themselves don't really drive a game story. So I'm curious about what the typical beats or plots look like in a game, and what the, I guess, ratio is of the personal side with a broader mission. Comparing that with changelings, who, for all their differences, are generally unified by the principle of keep the true Fae at bay. Is there something similarly unifying that drives Geist narratives? You said ghost cops. I don't know if that's kind of what it relies on, but
Yeah, despite my pithy thing, calling them ghost cops would definitely not be the right perspective on it. I think the answer is found in their X, Y, and especially Z splat, the Z splat being the crew. And again, I'm talking about second edition, which really does a lot of heavy lifting to clarify these things. So you have the burden, which again is what you personally want. And you can make an entire game out of just, we have 3 to 5 people who are trying to resolve their burdens in life and move on. And I guess these ghosts that are bound to them because they have no choice but to do that. Spicy. Fun fact, your Geist does not know who it was in life, so part of the adventure is trying to figure out that you're bound to the ghost of Al Capone, and you need to go hunt down his solid gold machine gun in order to free him from this mortal coil. Your focus on your crew is the other thing that defines what your stories are going to be about. I'm just going to read these again to keep it simple. It says, Sin Eaters' brush with death leads them to found their own peculiar religions. Fair enough. These faiths have been called many things: mysteries, cults, churches, heresies, but since the early 20th century, spreading outward from Alabama and New Orleans to the rest of the world, the preferred term has been crew. There are very nearly as many crews as there are Sin Eaters, but they can be roughly divided by the broad stroke of their ethoi. The 5 crew archetypes are Furies, crews that focus on balancing the scales of justice. They put right that which is wrong. Mourners, these Sin Eaters remember the dead, especially those the living have forgotten. They bring light into the darkness of the underworld and return with wisdom to share. Necropolitans, these crews care for the undead, protect them from the depredations of the underworld, and reunite them with loved ones across the veil. Pilgrims. To pilgrim, death is a step along a journey to something greater. They help the dead release their anchors and come to terms with their demise. And undertakers. Undertakers help the living get their affairs in order before they become a ghost's unfinished business. By changing how people perceive death and by understanding its metaphysics, they can change the game altogether. And speaking of games, the whole section about crews, and I think this is true in first edition as well, it is a mini game unto itself. It's not like just saying, I have an oath circle, a motley, or a noble house. Cool. There is a whole character creation and advancement system for having a crew.
which I suppose I'm into, but I imagine as a storyteller, as you said, you need to really get everybody on the same page before starting in order to kind of, because it's, people aren't just advancing their characters, they're also collectively advancing the crew.
I think the beauty of Geist, again, second edition, is that it's easy to do that because you just say to the group, okay, everybody, what is your basic crew idea? This is what your characters are working together on. And which one of these 3 end states do you want to work toward? And then people pick their burdens, and you have a game. That's it. You could make a game where you say, we're going to play Necropolitans, and we're going to make the world a more festive and fun place for the dead. And of course, we're going to go for the end path where we make the Underworld better.
Or you could throw a ghost prom.
You could throw a ghost prom. I need to run Geist.
There you go. Do Sin Eaters like regularly go into the Underworld? Is that like an every session occurrence?
It can be, in the same sense that wraiths who live in the Shadowlands prefer to be there, but they can go into the Maelstrom or Stygia whenever they want. It's easier for Sin Eaters to navigate down there, and they have a lot of advantages that mean that they are inoculated
they're swole
against the threats of the Underworld, and they are good at dealing with ghosts, but they're not the biggest fishes down there. You wander down far enough and you wind up in one of the dead dominions, which you can think of as kind of like Stygia from Wraith. It's some land with its own rules and literal old laws that you are not allowed to disobey. Some of them might make sense, like, hey, if you want to borrow a book from the Eternal Library, you have to read it here, do not check it out. And some of them are weird, like, do not shroud your head. Like, why can't I wear a hat in this realm? But your interest in why you might want to do that is going to be secondary to the fact that the Kerberoi, the guardians of the Underworld, rule over their dead dominions, and these are extremely powerful ghosts that will absolutely murder you if you mess around down there too much. And they can take on all sorts of shapes and sizes. So I would say that if you were doing a game where, let's say, one of the player characters was a bereaved who wanted to find her wife in the Underworld, and you wanted to play a group of mourners who are most interested in like helping out the Underworld, then yeah, you're probably going to be spending a lot of sessions down there. But I would not make that the focus of my first campaign, because if you do that, then you are diving deep into the more abstract and deep lore of the setting. You're getting away from the immediacy of helping ghosts here on Earth resolving their immediate problems. I think that's going to be a lot more compelling for an initial story for most groups. And you can have fun saying that one of your adventures is we go into the Underworld, we encounter Nikola Tesla, and he's like, hey, I'm real peeved that, I don't get enough credit around here. Help me get like these memoirs out and I'll give you the keys to some dead dominion. It's like, wow, that's really cool. Should not be your first adventure.
Yeah, I mean, I would run it that they go down there seldom. You could absolutely, I'm realizing, just run Orpheus as a Geist Chronicle. Like just the entire Orpheus story.
I'm thinking about that now. I love Orpheus. Did I tell you I ran a campaign?
You did, yeah. I mean, they really lightning in a bottle with Orpheus.
Such a good game. Listeners, highly recommend Orpheus.
Yep. So I wanted to just briefly mention the swollenness of Sin Eaters. They get like super stamina. They can spend plasm rather than lose health. They have a limited amount of automatic resurrection that isn't actually that great for you. As mentioned, they can see ghosts, communicate with ghosts, devour ghosts, look into the twilight, determine a mortal's health, their cause of death. Lots of things, which some of them are kind of like ported over from Wraith powers, but a lot of other ones which are discrete necromantic powers, things that you would actually buy necromancy dots for, that just seem to be natural talents that they have. So that alone would make them foes to be reckoned with in the right chronicle, on top of which membership even in a basic crew lets you do stuff like manipulate fate, boost your other powers. And yeah, they have a lot of advantages.
If you want to play a necromancer, playing a Sin Eater is going to be the best way to be someone who is just good at necromancy without a bunch of complicated strings or limitations attached. And in 2nd edition, they add on a few extra benefits. I think some of these overlap with what you said, but just to cover them briefly, they have the free tolerance for biology merit, so they're good at dealing with ghost stuff. They have an effective ghost rank, which means that they can overpower ghosts more easily. They can see ghosts possessing people. They are immune to being possessed.
They already are, kind of.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what they say. And they're just like, nope, nobody else can possess them because they got this Geist. In second edition, you can die as many times as you want, and it includes two of the best lines. System, dead. When the Sin Eater dies, she gains the dead condition, unless otherwise specified. And the more somber, a Sin Eater can beg for her Geist to let her remain dead, but she only stands a chance of succeeding if she succeeds at a relationship role with her Geist. Their liminal aura enables them to make ghosts have an easier time manifesting or disappearing. They can flare an aura, which spooks people and inspires ghosts. And they can even pull a Geist into their own body, unleash it, and have it temporarily take over. The only thing I think they're really missing is in first edition, you had as part of your ability to see somebody's life, you could literally see a number over their head saying how much time they had left in this world.
Oh, like The Sims, Death Edition. And a lot of these don't really have fully developed systems in the sense that we get with like Oniromancy or Hedge spinning in Lost, but they just have so many little tricks that really stack up, on top of which they have the manifestations and everything. But this is not Geist the podcast, so bringing us back once again to crossing this over with Changeling. So all of that lore we just mentioned, for starters, I want to ask, what is a Lost likely to know about a Sin Eater? Because we kind of have to retcon a little bit. This game came out near the end of Changeling's initial run, and there really wasn't much to do with the dead, in first edition at least, of Lost. So I'm inclined to say Changelings wouldn't know much by default unless the Chronicle demanded it. As you pointed out, the Autumn Court or maybe the Spring Court feels like a natural choice to have dealings with them. A Sin Eater whose Geist aligns more conceptually with summer or winter would make an interesting guest star too. You've read the Book of the Dead and that whole section. Where and how might Sin Eaters and Lost cross paths?
Several ways, most notably the Underworld. But let's start with the basics. You are correct that it would be unusual for changelings to know something about Sin Eaters and the Underworld, but there are some notable exceptions. There are several kiths that can interact with ghosts. I believe the Graverite most notably. And Darklings have a contract of darkness called Opening the Black Gate, which can open a path to the Underworld. And finally, the Autumn Court, the great sorcerers of the Changelings, are most likely to know something about the weirdness. Fun fact, the Hedge can accidentally deposit you into the Underworld.
Accident in heavy quotes.
Yes. Well, in fact, there is a story hook in the Book of the Dead that suggests that some changelings have discovered a path into the Underworld that is near an exit from Arcadia. So rather than having people risk the Hedge, they funnel them into the Underworld to go then find an averting gate that leads back into the mortal world.
Basically a Black Path of Balor.
Yeah, actually, that's a good way of looking at it. But all of this is beside the main point of why would you want to do any of this?
Yeah.
There are a few things that you can learn in the Underworld that you cannot learn elsewhere. In the Book of the Dead, we discover that if a changeling enters the Underworld, they might discover the Death Clause. The Death Clause is, to quote the book, as the name suggests, an ancient agreement between Fairy and the Underworld. The gentry agreed that they would be mortal, but that capital D death would not come for them until certain conditions were fulfilled. Every member of the gentry, like so many other things Fae, has a condition or a weapon that can fell him. Of course, since the gentry choose their own methods of demise, these conditions are absurdly obscure, but they are all possible. Just knowing this gives the lost a great deal of hope. It goes on to add, the Death Clause has benefits for changelings as well, though. A changeling that buys into the clause, which costs a dot of willpower, will quote-unquote purchase one death. The character can die once and return to life in the Underworld. This does leave the character with the problem of finding her way back to the living world, but she is alive. Can only do this once. Additionally, The Underworld has other weirdness, most notably the Grave Dream, which is a dead dominion where all dreams go to die. If you've ever dreamed of everything, had a wish, an aspiration, a fleeting thought, once you no longer remember it, it goes there. It does sometimes interact with people's mortal waking thoughts, and changelings are among the rare beings who have the ability to recognize when that is happening and explore the grave dream at their leisure. There is a entire section about it in the Book of the Dead, including its bizarre figures, the spiders that weave themselves over dead dreams, the mysterious dark man who may be the ruler of this realm, the hag that is the classic night hag that sits on your chest, and an Oneironaut changeling who's just like, hey, I'm a grave rat and I'm hanging out here and I'm learning things.
It wasn't one of the Morphians associated with the Grave Dream as well? Am I remembering that right?
Oh gosh, the Pale Brother, maybe?
Yeah, something like that. That
Yeah.
was a thing.
But the point is that the Underworld is a place where things go to die, and that is something which changelings can use to cultivate magic and even obtain new tools for what they do to get along in the world.
So, more on the Earth side of things, I was thinking about kind of some of the aspects here. And with that thematic contrast that I keep harping about, where each game's protagonists kind of present a different take on trauma and recovery and another attempt at living in the world, you can run with that as something meditative. So, like a visiting sin eater helps a freehold re examine their approach to some conflict informed by the history of their Geist, whether that means they calm things or instigate things. You could get a little more personal and have a sin eater mentor affiliated with a court that shares their values, or maybe they're called upon when local changelings need some kind of expert on the deceased. And that can range from actually needing to explore the underworld in all of those ways, or just something simpler like I like the idea of a noir murder mystery or mysterious happenings around a Day of the Dead celebration. I think it might be harder to have Lost and Bound together as PCs in a single game, just because they have rather different values and directions that they're pointed in. But even as I kind of like thought about that in my notes, I kept thinking about Storm and Yukio from the X-Men. And just like the plucky sin eater who loves life, helping the uptight elemental learn to loosen up a bit, that kind of thing. But anyway.
I think that the notion of having a changeling and a sin eater team up is something that's integral that we drill down into for one very important relationship between the two games, and that is that if you are able to successfully combine the themes of Geist and Changeling, then you can make any number of Motley Crew jokes.
This is necessary. Seriously, though, I think you are right that there are important story beats that you could hit that would be relevant to both. I mean, the notion of unfinished business is another connection that means something quite different to both of them, but is equally meaningful. With antagonism, I think sin eaters could also make formidable foes, but that there's not really inherent motivation for them to be against the Fae. The storyteller can manufacture something like, oh, there's a Geist who's determined to have their sin eater run the city in a certain way, and that's counter to what the Changeling Freehold wants.
I have an easy one for you there. Because there is an explicit example in I forget which book that one of the true Fae does not take people while they're alive. She waits for them to be dead and then takes their ghosts.
Ooh.
You could easily have a game where one of the true Fae is stealing ghosts to bring to Arcadia, and obviously the changelings want to stop that, but then obviously the senators are going to go, who's kidnapping the ghosts? What are the gentry? And then they have to team up with the changelings.
What if you had fetch ghosts? That'd be interesting.
I want to talk about doppelgangers now because you just hit upon something.
The other thing I was going to say is that you could also have a situation where like a changeling is killing mortals and every single one of them is coming back as a ghost, and the sin eaters are like, where are all these ghosts coming from? So kind of the inverse. But yes, talk about their take on doppelgangers.
Okay, so this is fascinating because you might remember how I said that the ghost that a person leaves behind, it's you, but it's not you. It's a snapshot of you as you were when you died.
Mhm.
Consequentially, near-death experiences can also create ghosts. And that does mean that if you have a near-death experience, there may now be a copy of you that is hanging around you, and it is getting very upset watching you move on with your life and change away from being the person that it is. They get vengeful about this and they try to correct their living counterparts to going back to being the way that they should be. I can obviously see a changeling hearing about somebody being haunted by a copy of themselves and thinking, is that a changeling? Is this person a fetch? Is it a fetch that's haunting them? And looking into that, then discovering that no, this is something that is somehow weirder to us, and then needing to team up with some sin eaters to solve the doppelganger problem.
It's a little bit like a very specific expression of the kinds that we saw in urban legends, where those were spawned by kind of existential dilemmas. And what could be a greater moment of that than confronting death?
Ouch, yeah.
Another idea I had was, if you want to mess with the metaphysics a little, when a true Fae gets exiled to Earth, and if they eventually erode away into a Geist, a weird hybrid archetype entity, then form bargains, because the Fae love bargains, in order to sustain themselves. It's like the Summer Court or militants find out that that's the true nature of the Sin Eaters. That could lead to some conflict.
Ooh, that would be spooky. Book of the Dead implies, at least implies, that you can find the ghosts of the true Fae inside the Underworld if you look hard enough.
Seems pretty Geist-like.
Right?
Probably these options, though, are at their best when it's not clearly defined, or when you're not going all in on one or the other. I haven't read the Dark Era we're going to be reading, so don't spoil it for me, but I imagine having changelings and sin eaters scattered across multiple sides of a mythic historical war with much death and confusion seems like a pretty good scenario to focus on how these themes really complement and conflict with each other. That line between ally and adversary gets very murky in those kinds of situations.
I will not say, but I will add on a few other ways that they can team up, if you'll indulge me going through some bullet points.
Let's do it. Let's home stretch.
Here we go. Okay, Geist is a game about hope and joy, two feelings that changelings, especially the Spring Court, seek to cultivate in themselves and others.
I'll allow it.
One of the vengeful might team up with the Summer Court to exact vengeance on their own victimizer, and the Summer Court teaming up with the Furies to exact wrath is an obvious perfect fit. It's just, are we exacting upon the living or the dead or both?
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Spring courtiers might want to team up with any of the 5 burdens to help them resolve what is keeping them here in life, because they're all about that desire life.
That's how you avoid that clarity break.
The Autumn Court might align with a Bereaved, the two working to explore the secrets of the dead and learn more of that wonderful magic.
A marriage made in Avernus.
Winter Courtiers might mix well with members of the Mourner crew, working together to help people work through grief. Similarly, they might work with Pilgrims or Undertakers to help people let go.
Insert topical joke about hell freezing over.
Expanding on a previous point, changelings might be curious about how the capital B bargain works, as it is a novel form of deal-making. Could somebody make the bargain with a Hedge ghost, one of the true Fae who wants to experience the world?
I know that you said death clause earlier, like in text. Obviously, yes, it means the thing, but I just can't help but think about a villain named Death Clause. Brings me no end of joy.
For the Changeling Mage superhero crossover, which is a thing for Mage.
Perfect.
The Power of Memoria from 2nd edition can be useful for characters trying to recall their pasts, which is an issue for changelings who have fractured memories. They would very much love to find somebody who can help them with that.
All sensible.
This is just a line from Book of the Dead that I like. The Lost know a few things about gateways, having been dragged through at least one. The notion that Avernian gates have keys isn't so strange, and members of their Autumn Court, fascinated as they are by magic of all types, might have collected legends about ways to visit the dead. In fact, One could supposedly encounter the Fae of this court at gatherings held once a year at the autumnal equinox, where they remember the dead and share information about matters of the soul. Keys to low places will certainly count, but getting an invitation to the gathering is no mean feat. I feel like they're referencing something from fairy stories here.
I mean, well, if you want to go deep into folklore, the Fae and the Underworld do have kind of a long-standing association to the point that that is where they live in some traditions. But yeah, I'll have to look at that and dig into it maybe.
Exploring the grave dream is another thing which may fascinate changelings. However, they may be unfamiliar with its old laws and be concerned about whether it has anything to do with Arcadia. Having the company of Sin Eaters, who may want to go there because they need to recover memories in order to help finish one of their own plans, would naturally want to team up with them to explore this fascinating dead dominion.
Naturally.
Also, changelings can do a neuromancy there, and doing a neuromancy in the underworld just sounds really cool.
Yikes.
You can use ghosts to tell stories about people who didn't make it out of Arcadia, or as a weird populace for the true fate of Farm, as beings that the Autumn Court may study, or even as deceased changelings.
There's a plot thread in the Lucifer comic where something about like the goddess of the underworld is essentially co-opting the Dream King's territory by like sending ghosts through the dreams of the living or something. Trying to remember exactly how that worked, but I could see that as a point of connection. Yeah, ideas.
A few final things on the Underworld. One of the dead dominions, one of the lowest, is the Ocean of Fragments, which is an ocean that gradually strips away people's identities until there is nothing left, not even your name and your pronouns. It is eerily similar to the feeling that changelings get when they lose parts of themselves. And perhaps by searching the ocean, they might find one of those missing pieces. The Dominion of the Crossroads is a place where bargains are said to be especially powerful, and it has a goblin market like setup. And finally, Changeling 2nd Edition introduces the Huntsman, the agents of the true Fae that will hunt changelings to the ends of the earth. And Geist 2nd Edition introduces the Reapers, which are ghosts empowered by the chthonic gods of the underworld to drag ghosts from the material world and bring them down. Maybe the two of them would team up to go hunt a particularly troublesome changeling and their ghostly companion.
I'm not looking to recreate Sam Hate in the Chronicles of Darkness, but in terms of a target that they could have, can a changeling become a sin eater?
Ooh, okay. I know how that would have to work, because the weird way that souls work in Chronicles of Darkness. The changeling would have to die, and then at the moment of their death, a Geist would have to show up and say, hey, how about we bind with each other and you keep going? At which point I would say the changing loses their soul, the Geist takes its position, and then they become a Sin Eater that maybe has some weird leftover abilities from having been a changeling, but is not a changing Sin Eater hybrid.
Like a sin eater with a Kith blessing or something.
Yeah, just get a little extra merit or something like that. I think that would be fine to do.
Interesting. That seems like a good place to put a bow on this concoction. So hopefully this inspires people to, if not play Geist alongside Changeling, then at least look into Geist as something to incorporate into a Changeling game.
I also recommend Geist to folks who are frustrated with how Wraith works. A common complaint is that it's difficult for Wraiths to interact with the lands of the living. And while there are ways around that within the game itself, I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint. If you play a Sin Eater, you are, again, basically a Wraith that has taken back control over their own body and is going for a second chance. Check it out.
Also, Mummy the Resurrection. In the meantime, other things that you might want to check out include our links to discuss on social media and whatnot. These include joining our Discord at discord.me/CTP, sending an email to podcast@changelingthepodcast.com, looking up Changeling the Podcast on Facebook and YouTube, visiting Mastodon, changelingpod at dice.camp, or signing up for our Patreon at patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Links to all of which are in the show notes to this episode. Once again, I've been I don't know, what are the types again? the forgotten known as Puka.
And I am the necropolitan known as Fetch.
Oh, I should have gone with that instead.
Necropolitan's the best. It's what I would do. I'd be like, look, I cannot leave this world behind because I have not finished running all of my RPGs. I have so many more games that I need to run before I can move on.
That might be the saddest and most inspiring thing I've ever heard. Merry meet, merry part, and Mary Tyler Moore. There are many more keys and manifestations than those presented in the Geist core book, representing the myriad aspects of death and the underworld. The Uncanny Valley key manipulates emotions of disgust around its target, while the elemental Salt Crust key echoes mummification with its preservative powers. The Red Tape manifestation invokes the endless bureaucracy of the afterlife to inflict onerousness on others, and the Sugarloaf manifestation deals with cakes, pies, and tarts of all kinds, tapping into the fact that death by dessert is the sweetest death of all. Sadly, the short run of the Geist line means that these and other options never made it to publication, but here at Changeling the podcast we do our best to unearth these and other tidbits from the history of the World of Darkness. We're supported in this endeavor by our most excellent patrons, who include Bad Company, Ben the Canadian, Sig Lawson Jr., Derek, Dorcadus, Ellerus, Henry Kraft, Eobol, Oreo, Rascaboose, Rebecca P., Sandchicker, Sija, the Crew of Erebus, and Ware Buffalo. If you'd like to join their ranks, check out www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast and consider signing up. We also appreciate reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. And feel free to tell your best undead friends about us. Otherwise, be safe, stay strong, and keep clear of mysterious Avernian portals echoing with the anguished moans of 1,000 displaced souls. For it's always best to keep things upbeat as you keep on dreaming.